Quick question. Are you kidding me? Like, I am so sick and tired of just everything right now. And I'm so sick of waiting. Like, when is it going to be my turn? What more do I have to do to fix myself before I'm just allowed to be happy? Before I'm allowed to meet this universe soulmate person that God supposedly has for me? How much harder do I have to pray and manifest and wait?
There's a strange moment happening right now, one that most people were told would never come. After decades of being told they were unnecessary, unwanted, and even harmful, men are suddenly being told they are needed again. Not quietly, not subtly, but openly and increasingly urgently. What makes this moment fascinating is not that women are saying they need men, but that men are no longer listening. And by the end of this video, you will understand why that silence is the loudest response of all. Before we get into it, make sure you like the video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all if you want more great Angry Guy content, and you want every single video the moment we release it. It helps the channel more than you realize, and it keeps this conversation going. Also, check out Angry's Crypto Academy if you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth. Angry's Crypto Academy is where you can learn how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly with a long-term mindset focused on security and ownership. The Academy is linked in the description of the video, so go check it out now. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It helps keep the lights on and the content coming. Now let's talk about what is actually happening, because this didn't come out of nowhere and it didn't happen overnight. For years, men were told a very specific story about themselves. They were told they were the problem. They were told their instincts were wrong, their nature was dangerous, and their presence was unnecessary. They were told to step aside, to be quiet, to unlearn themselves, and to accept a supporting role in a world that increasingly treated them as disposable. This message did not come from one place. It came from media, from institutions, from pop culture, and from social pressure that was relentless and constant. Men were told not to approach, not to speak, not to look the wrong way, not to exist in a way that might make someone uncomfortable. Everyday behavior was reinterpreted as suspicious or hostile. Simple social interaction became something to fear rather than something to enjoy. Over time, the message became clear. The safest option was distance. The safest move was withdrawal. And men listened. What is rarely acknowledged is that men are very good at pattern recognition. When the same lesson is repeated enough times, they adapt. They do not argue forever. They do not protest endlessly. Eventually, they step away. And that is exactly what happened. Men began opting out of dating, out of courtship, out of social rituals that were once considered normal, not out of bitterness, but out of self-preservation. There is a difference between being alone and feeling at peace. Many men discovered that when they removed constant social pressure, expectations, and judgment, their lives became quieter and more stable. Their finances improved, their stress dropped, their sense of control returned. They realized they could live simply, comfortably, and with purpose without constantly proving their worth to anyone else. Minimalism came naturally. Fewer obligations, fewer emotional negotiations, fewer financial risks tied to unpredictable outcomes. Men focused on their health, their hobbies, their work, and their internal growth. They stopped chasing validation and started building routines. For many, this was not a loss, it was a relief. At the same time, something else was happening. The structures that had relied on men's participation began to strain. Dating markets changed. Social expectations shifted again. Suddenly, voices began to emerge, saying something unexpected, that men were needed, that things were harder than expected, that independence did not look the way it was advertised. This is not about blame, it is about cause and effect. For decades, men were told they were not essential. That message was internalized. Now, as economic pressure increases and social support systems weaken, the absence of men is being felt, not emotionally alone, but structurally. Men have historically absorbed risk. They have been the buffer between uncertainty and stability. When that buffer disappears, reality feels sharper. Men stepping away did not collapse a society overnight. It revealed cracks that were already there. Rising costs of living, isolation, and the difficulty of maintaining stability alone were masked for a long time by shared responsibility. When shared responsibility disappears, the weight becomes very real. What makes this moment unique is that men are not rushing back. They are observing, they are listening, and they are comparing words to outcomes. Many have learned to trust what they can see rather than what they are told. They are asking themselves whether returning would bring peace or reintroduce chaos. This is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable because it challenges a narrative that assumed men would always return no matter how they were treated. That assumption turned out to be wrong. Men did not leave to punish anyone. They left because the cost outweighed the benefit. They left because the rules changed without their consent, and the risks became one sided. They left because stability required distance. Now, as more people speak openly about needing men again, the response is not anger, it is silence. Silence from men who are finally rested. Silence from men who built lives that do not depend on approval. Silence from men who learned that peace is something you protect, not something you negotiate away. This silence is often misunderstood as resentment. It is not. It is clarity. Men are not organizing. They are not protesting. They are not demanding anything. They are simply continuing forward without engaging. That is what makes it so powerful. There is nothing to argue against when someone has quietly moved on. Many men discovered something important in their solitude. That happiness does not require constant companionship. That fulfillment can come from routine, purpose, and self respect. That a simple life with financial stability, health, and autonomy is more valuable than chaos dressed up as excitement. This is why appeals based on guilt do not work. Men are no longer motivated by shame. They already carried it for years. What replaced it was self awareness. And once self awareness takes hold, it is very difficult to reverse. There is also a generational element to this. Younger men watched older men struggle through systems that did not reward loyalty or sacrifice. They saw outcomes that did not match the promises. And they adjusted early. They learned to prioritize themselves first, not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of realism. The modern man is not angry. He is cautious. He is selective. He is aware of trade offs. He understands that time, attention, and money are finite resources. And once you learn that, you stop giving them away without clear value in return. As economic conditions tighten, this mindset becomes even stronger. Men who are walking away are not reckless. They are conservative with their energy. They plan, they save, they invest. They focus on longevity rather than intensity. That is why you see men choosing smaller living spaces, simpler routines, and fewer dependencies, not because they cannot do more, but because they do not need to. Freedom becomes more attractive than status. Meanwhile, the cultural conversation struggles to catch up. Many expected men to adapt endlessly, to keep adjusting, to keep apologizing. Instead, men reached the limit and quietly stepped back. This is not the end of relationships, it is the end of imbalance. If men return, it will not be to the same conditions. It will not be based on obligation or pressure. It will be based on mutual benefit, respect, and peace. And many men are perfectly fine if that return never happens. That is the reality many are still processing. Men learned that being alone does not mean being empty. It means being undisturbed. It means waking up without conflict. It means control over one's time and future. Once that realization sets in, it changes everything. And this is why the current moment feels so jarring, because the rules were assumed to be permanent and they were not. Men adapted, men moved on, and now the world is adjusting to their absence. This story is not finished. We are still in the early chapters, but one thing is already clear. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. Men are no longer driven by narratives. They are driven by outcomes. And once you see that clearly, you cannot unsee it. To understand where this leads, you have to understand how deep the shift really is. This is not a trend. This is not a temporary reaction. This is a structural change in how men see themselves in relation to society. Once that lens changes, it does not easily snap back into place. For a long time, men were told that their value came from what they provided, not just financially, but emotionally, socially, and physically. They were expected to absorb pressure, smooth over conflict, and take responsibility when things went wrong. When things went right, it was assumed to be normal. When things went wrong, it was assumed to be their fault. Over time, that imbalance wears a person down. What finally broke the cycle was not anger, but exhaustion. Men reached a point where they realized that no amount of effort would ever be enough to change the narrative. The goalposts kept moving, expectations increased while appreciation disappeared. That is when withdrawal became logical rather than emotional. Men did not wake up one day and decide to walk away from everything. They adjusted gradually. First fewer dates, then less engagement, then silence. Each step reduced stress. Each step improved stability. Each step confirmed that the problem was not a lack of effort, but a lack of return. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this shift is the idea that men are isolating themselves out of resentment. That assumption misses the truth entirely. Most men who step back did not do so dramatically. They did not announce it. They simply stopped participating in systems that consistently produced negative outcomes. When men step away from dating, they do not suddenly stop being social creatures. They build friendships, they pursue interests, they invest in skills, they focus on health. They create routines that give them structure without constant emotional volatility. They learn to enjoy quiet evenings, predictable days, and steady progress. This is why attempts to shame men back into participation fail. Shame only works when someone still seeks approval. Men who have walked away no longer do. They replaced external validation with internal standards. That is a one-way transition. Another piece of this puzzle is how technology accelerated everything. Dating apps turned relationships into transactions. Social media amplified extremes and rewarded attention seeking behavior. Public callouts, recordings, and online judgment made everyday interactions feel risky. Men responded rationally by minimizing exposure. Risk assessment changed. Men began asking simple questions. What is the upside? What is the downside? What happens if things go wrong? When the downside became severe and the upside uncertain, opting out became the sensible choice. And this is especially true for younger men who grew up watching these dynamics play out in real time. They saw careers destroyed over misunderstandings. They saw reputations damaged permanently. They saw systems that assumed guilt first and explanation later. And they learned quickly, and instead of rebelling loudly, they disengaged quietly. This quiet disengagement is difficult for society to respond to because there is no clear target. You cannot argue with someone who is not arguing back. You cannot negotiate with someone who is content. You cannot pressure someone who has already let go of expectations. That is why the tone of the conversation has shifted. Instead of telling men to leave, there is now confusion about why they are gone. Instead of telling men they are not needed, there is concern about their absence. This reversal is not strategic, it is reactive. But men are not reactive anymore. They are deliberate. Many men have come to see peace as a scarce resource. Once they have it, they guard it carefully. They structure their lives around maintaining it. They choose work arrangements that give them autonomy. They avoid unnecessary conflict. They simplify finances. They reduce dependency. This is not weakness, it is optimization. There's also a financial dimension that cannot be ignored. Men who are not dating spend less, they save more, they invest more intentionally, they take fewer financial risks tied to other people's decisions. Over time, this compounds. Men realize that being responsible for themselves alone is manageable. Being responsible for outcomes you cannot control is not. That distinction changes how you approach relationships entirely. As inflation rises and economic pressure increases, this clarity becomes even more important. Men who are walking away are not reckless spenders, they are planners. They think in years, not weekends. They value stability over spectacle. This is why the idea that men are missing out rings hollow to them. Missing out on what exactly? Stress, uncertainty, financial strain, emotional turbulence. When the alternatives are framed honestly, the choice becomes obvious. The cultural narrative still struggles to process this because it assumed men would always absorb the consequences. That assumption no longer holds. Men are no longer volunteering to be the safety net. Historically, men acted as shock absorbers. They took risks, they worked longer hours, they stepped into danger. They buffered others from reality. When men stop doing that, reality becomes more visible. You can see the shift in how people talk about survival, costs, and expectations. Things that were once taken for granted are now described as overwhelming. Responsibilities that were once shared are now described as unbearable. This is not because the tasks changed, it is because the support disappeared. Men stepping away exposed how much invisible labor they were providing. This does not mean men are owed gratitude. It means their absence has consequences, and those consequences are still unfolding. What makes this moment different from past cycles is that men now have alternatives. They have access to information, communities, and resources that allow them to build fulfilling lives independently. They are no longer isolated by default. Solitude is no longer loneliness. Men can learn, invest, create, and connect on their own terms. That freedom changes leverage entirely. So when messages appear urging men to return, to re engage, to rebuild what was lost, the question men ask is simple: what has changed? If the answer is nothing fundamental, then the response remains silence. Men are not hostile, they are unconvinced. They have learned to trust observable reality over promises. They watch actions, not words. They look at incentives, not intentions. This is not cynicism, it is experience. And experience taught them that peace is earned by boundaries, not sacrifice. This is why many men are thriving quietly while the public conversation grows louder. They are not trying to convince anyone. They are not seeking validation. They are simply living in alignment with what works for them. That quiet alignment is powerful. And as this continues, society will have to adjust to a new baseline, one where men are optional participants rather than automatic providers, one where engagement must be mutually beneficial rather than assumed, one where respect is foundational rather than performative. Whether that adjustment happens smoothly or painfully remains to be seen. What is clear is that men are not going back to how things were. The past is no longer attractive to them. They have seen another way to live, and it works. This does not mean relationships are impossible. It means they must be different. They must offer peace, cooperation, and shared responsibility. Anything less will not compete with solitude. That is the standard now. And standards, once raised, rarely lower again. We are watching the long term consequences of choices made over decades. This is not a temporary phase. This is a recalibration. And the sooner that is understood, the more honest the conversation can become. Because men are not lost. They are not confused. They are not angry. They are done negotiating their peace away. There is an important point that often gets missed in all of this, and it is that men did not walk away because they failed. They walked away because they succeeded at understanding the system they were operating in. Once you see incentives clearly, you stop arguing with them. You adapt to them. An adaptation, in this case, meant choosing distance. For many men, the realization came quietly. It was not triggered by a single event, but by a pattern of effort without appreciation, a pattern of risk without reward, a pattern of responsibility without authority. Over time, patterns teach lessons more effectively than lectures ever could. Men learned that saying less reduce conflict, that explaining less reduce misunderstandings, that expecting less reduced disappointment, and eventually that participating less reduced exposure. This was not bitterness, it was calibration. And what replaced constant engagement was observation. Men started watching instead of reacting. They listened without responding. They noticed contradictions between what was said and what was done. They paid attention to outcomes rather than intentions. This shift alone changes how you move through the world. Once men stopped centering their lives around external validation, something unexpected happened. Their sense of self stabilized. They no longer needed approval to feel grounded. They no longer felt compelled to prove anything. Their energy, once scattered, became focused. This focus showed up everywhere: in work, in health, in finances, in personal discipline. Men who were once stretched thin became deliberate. They learned that consistency beats intensity, that progress beats drama, that calm beats chaos. It also changed how men viewed time. Time stopped being something to fill and became something to protect. Evenings were no longer spent navigating tension or uncertainty. They were spent resting, learning, or creating. Weekends became restorative instead of exhausting. This is why many men describe walking away not as loss, but as relief. Relief from pressure that never seemed to lead anywhere. Relief from expectations that shifted constantly. Relief from having to decode rules that changed without warning. Another layer to this is trust. Trust eroded slowly, not because of one major betrayal, but because of many small ones. Promises that did not align with reality. Standards that applied in one direction only. Accountability that was selective. Over time, trust becomes caution. Men became cautious with their words, with their commitments, with their resources. They learned that once something is given, it may not be returned. That generosity without boundaries invites imbalance. And so boundaries became non negotiable. This does not mean men stopped caring, it means they became selective about where care was placed. Care became intentional rather than automatic, earned rather than assumed. That selectivity is often misread as coldness. It is not, it is discernment. Men also began questioning narratives they had absorbed without scrutiny, narratives about obligation, about sacrifice, about what a good man is supposed to endure. When they examined these ideas against lived experience, many did not hold up. They asked simple questions: who benefits? Who pays the cost? Who carries the risk? And when the answers were consistently one sided, the conclusion became unavoidable. What followed was a redefinition of masculinity that did not rely on external approval. Strength became internal stability, confidence became self trust, success became autonomy. Leadership became personal responsibility rather than social expectation. This redefinition did not require permission. It did not require consensus. It happened individually, quietly, and at scale. As more men made the shift, something else became visible. Many systems had quietly depended on male overextension, on men working longer, sacrificing more, and absorbing pressure without complaint. When men stopped doing that, strain appeared. This strain is often framed as confusion or disappointment, but confusion only exists when assumptions are broken. The assumption that men would always show up regardless of conditions turned out to be incorrect. Men learned that absence is sometimes the only leverage available, not as a threat, but as a boundary. And boundaries do not argue, they simply exist. The men who are walking away are not asking for apologies. They are not demanding reform. They are not issuing ultimatums. They are simply choosing what works for them and ignoring what does not. This is why attempts to re engage men using old strategies fall flat. Guilt no longer works. Shame no longer works. Fear no longer works. These tools require emotional investment. Men who have stepped away no longer offer it freely, and what remains effective is only one thing: peace. If an interaction offers peace, men will consider it. If it offers stress, confusion, or imbalance, they will decline without explanation. That simplicity is new, and it unsettles people who were accustomed to endless negotiation. There is also a cultural lag happening. Institutions move slowly, narratives take time to update, but individual behavior adapts quickly. Men adapted long before the conversation caught up. This lag creates tension. Public messaging still assumes men are waiting to be convinced. In reality, many have already moved on. They are not undecided, they are settled. This is why the current appeals feel strange. They are aimed at a version of men that no longer exists, a version that prioritized duty over well being, a version that accepted imbalance as normal. That version has retired. Now, the modern man understands trade offs, he understands opportunity cost. He understands that every yes requires a no somewhere else, and he chooses carefully. Men who are thriving in solitude are not hiding, they are simply not advertising. They do not need applause, they do not need recognition. Their reward is internal. They wake up without dread. They go to sleep without unresolved conflict. Their lives are quieter, but not empty, fuller, but not crowded. This is the part that is hardest for critics to accept, that many men are genuinely content without constant companionship. That fulfillment does not always come from relationships, that peace can be enough. This does not invalidate relationships, it reframes them. Relationships become optional enhancements rather than necessities. They must add value rather than consume it. That reframing changes everything. As this continues, there will be more discussion, more think pieces, more attempts to diagnose the situation. But diagnosis without self reflection will not resolve anything. Men did not disappear, they withdrew. And withdrawal is reversible only under new conditions. And those conditions are simple: mutual respect, shared responsibility, predictability, peace. Anything else will not compete with the life men have built for themselves. And so the silence continues, not because men have nothing to say, but because they have already said it through action. They walked away. And in doing so, they found something many never expected, and they found themselves. What often gets overlooked is how quietly this transition happened. There were no headlines announcing that men were stepping back, no formal declaration, no unified movement. It happened the way most real changes happen: one decision at a time, spread across millions of individual lives. One man deciding not to go on another date, another deciding not to explain himself anymore, another deciding that peace mattered more than participation. Over time, those individual decisions formed a pattern, and patterns tell the truth faster than words ever do. Men began to notice that the less they engaged, the better their lives felt. Not perfect, not free of difficulty, but more predictable, less emotionally volatile, more within their control. Predictability for many men is not boring. It is grounding. It allows focus. It allows planning. It allows progress. This is where the misunderstanding deepens. Many assume that men crave constant excitement or validation. In reality, most men crave stability. A stable environment allows them to build. When the environment becomes chaotic, men do not try to dominate it. They leave it. For decades, men were told that leaving was failure, that walking away meant weakness, that endurance was the ultimate virtue. But endurance only makes sense when the direction is clear and the outcome is worth it. When neither is true, endurance becomes self harm. Men learned that lesson the hard way. Another important element here is how language itself changed. Ordinary behaviors were redefined as suspicious. Intent was assumed rather than clarified. Mistakes were treated as character flaws. Over time, this creates an environment where silence feels safer than speech. Men adapted by saying less, then by doing less, then by being seen less. And in that reduced visibility, they found something unexpected: freedom from constant interpretation. When you are no longer constantly explaining yourself, defending yourself, or proving yourself, your mental bandwidth expands. Men redirected that bandwidth inward, toward self improvement, toward long term goals, toward building lives that made sense to them rather than impressing others. This inward shift is critical to understand. Men did not replace relationships with emptiness. They replaced external chaos with internal order. That order looks different for each man. For some, it is fitness. For others, it is craftsmanship. For others, it is learning, investing, or creating. But the common thread is autonomy, the ability to decide without negotiation. Once autonomy is experienced, it becomes addictive in the healthiest way. You start asking whether anything you add to your life is worth what it costs you. If it is not, you decline without guilt. This mindset naturally reshapes priorities. Men become more intentional about where they live, how they work, and how they spend. Large social circles shrink into smaller, more reliable ones. Obligations become chosen rather than assumed. This is why many men report that their lives became simpler but richer, less crowded but more meaningful. Simplicity is often mistaken for lack. In reality, it is clarity. There is also a psychological shift that occurs when men stop chasing approval. Anxiety drops, decision making improves. Confidence becomes quieter but more durable. Men stop reacting and start responding. This change is subtle but profound. It alters how men interact with the world. They are less defensive, less reactive, less invested in winning arguments or being seen a certain way. That calm is often mistaken for disengagement, but it is actually grounding. Men who are grounded do not seek validation, they seek alignment. Alignment between effort and reward, between risk and benefit, between values and outcomes. When alignment is missing, men disengage, not angrily, logically. This logic extends to relationships. Men now evaluate relationships the same way they evaluate other commitments. Does this add stability? Does this add peace? Does this add value? If the answer is unclear or negative, they do not proceed. This evaluation process is often criticized as transactional, but in reality, it is responsible. Time and energy are limited resources. Treating them as valuable is not cold, it is mature. The previous expectation was that men would offer unlimited time, attention, and resources up front and hope for balance later. Experience taught them that hope is not a strategy. So men stopped leading with sacrifice. They stopped overextending. They stopped investing deeply without clear reciprocity. This shift alone filters out many situations that would have led to stress. What remains are fewer interactions, but higher quality ones. Another factor driving this shift is economic reality. The cost of living has increased dramatically. Mistakes are more expensive and recovery takes longer. Men cannot afford to make decisions based on outdated assumptions. In a high cost environment, caution is not pessimism, it is survival. Men who are walking away are not opting out of life, they are opting into sustainability. They understand that stability compounds over time, just like instability does. This long term thinking separates those who adapt from those who struggle. Men who plan conservatively may appear unambitious to outsiders, but they are often the ones who endure. Endurance, in this context, no longer means suffering through imbalance. It means building systems that work quietly over time. This is why men are increasingly focused on financial independence, skill development, and personal health. These are areas where effort reliably produces results. Unlike social dynamics that are unpredictable and often asymmetric, predictable systems are comforting. They reward discipline, they punish neglect, but they do so consistently. Men prefer consistency over chaos. As more men structure their lives around consistency, the gap between expectations and reality grows. Expectations that assumed men would always fill certain roles now meet resistance. Not because men are refusing, but because they are unavailable. Unavailable by choice. This is a critical distinction. Men are not trapped, they are not excluded, they are opting out. And opt out behavior is much harder to counter than rebellion. You cannot punish someone who does not care. You cannot coerce someone who has alternatives. You cannot shame someone who is content. That contentment is what many did not anticipate. For years, it was assumed that men needed constant engagement to feel fulfilled. That assumption underestimated men's capacity for solitude. Men have always been capable of spending long periods focused on a task, a craft, or a goal. Modern life simply gave them permission to do so without apology. Solitude is no longer framed as failure, it is framed as space, space to think, space to recover, space to grow. Men who take the space often emerge more self aware, not less. They understand their limits, they understand their needs, they understand what they are willing to tolerate and what they are not. This clarity is irreversible, and once a man knows that his peace is fragile and valuable, he protects it instinctively. He does not argue about it, he does not justify it, he simply lives accordingly. This is why the current moment feels tense, because clarity on one side meets confusion on the other. Men know what they want, or at least what they do not want, and that is enough to guide their decisions. As this continues, more men will reach the same conclusions, not because they are told to, but because the outcomes speak for themselves. Peace becomes the baseline. Anything that threatens it is optional. There's not a rejection of society, it is a recalibration of participation. And men are no longer default contributors. They are selective participants. And selection changes everything. As this recalibration continues, something subtle but important begins to surface. Men are no longer defining success the way they were taught to. Success is no longer measured by approval, status, or external validation. It is measured by how little friction exists between who they are and how they live. The smaller that gap becomes, the more settled a man feels. For a long time, many men lived in contradiction. They were told one thing and experienced another. They were told that participation would be rewarded, that effort would be recognized, that sacrifice would be meaningful. But live reality showed something else. Over time, the contradiction became impossible to ignore. Men resolved it the only way that made sense. They aligned their actions with reality rather than expectation. This alignment is what gives many men their calm. When you stop fighting what is and start working with it, stress drops dramatically. You no longer feel like you are failing at a script that was never written for your benefit. You stop trying to earn something that keeps moving out of reach. That calm is often mistaken for apathy. It is not. It is acceptance. Men accepted that they cannot control how they are perceived. They cannot control shifting social standards. They cannot control narratives that cast them as problems rather than participants. What they can control is where they place their energy. Once that becomes clear, the decision to walk away stops feeling dramatic. It becomes practical. This practicality shows up in small choices: declining invitations that feel obligatory, avoiding environments that feel adversarial, choosing routines over novelty. These choices compound. Over time, they reshape an entire life. Men also realize that constant self justification is exhausting. Explaining intentions, defending normal behavior, clarifying motives, none of this produces stability. Silence does. Silence removes risk. Silence avoids misinterpretation. Silence creates space to observe rather than react. This does not mean men stop thinking. It means they started thinking more clearly. Observation replaced participation. Men watched trends play out without inserting themselves into them. They noticed how often the same patterns repeated, how often blame shifted, how rarely accountability was shared. This observation reinforced their decision. Every confirmation made returning less appealing. Another element worth addressing is how men relate to hardship. Men are not unfamiliar with difficulty. They have always understood that life involves struggle. What they rejected was struggle without purpose. Hardship is tolerable when it leads somewhere, when it builds something, when it is shared fairly. But hardship that feels arbitrary, constant, and unacknowledged erodes motivation. Men decided that unnecessary hardship was optional. This decision did not require anger, it required honesty. Men asked themselves whether the challenges they were facing were making them stronger or simply draining them. When the answer was consistently the latter, the choice became obvious. Walking away was not avoidance, it was triage. As more men make this choice, the effects ripple outward. Social dynamics change, expectations go unmet, roles once assumed are left vacant. This creates discomfort, especially for systems built on predictability. But predictability based on assumption is fragile. Once assumptions fail, adaptation becomes necessary. Men adapted first because they had to. Others are adapting now because they have no choice. This lag creates friction. Some still believe men will return if pressured enough. Others believe men must be convinced. Both misunderstand the situation. Men do not need convincing, they need alignment. If participation offers peace, they will participate. If it does not, they will not. There is no moral argument that overrides this calculation. There is no narrative strong enough to compete with lived experience. This is why appeals framed around obligation fall flat. Obligation without benefit is no longer persuasive. Men learned that lesson early. The men who have walked away are not looking to be saved, re educated, or corrected. They are content. That contentment is quiet but firm. They structure their lives around reliability, predictable income, predictable routines, predictable outcomes. This predictability allows long term planning. Long term planning creates security. Security creates peace. This chain is simple but powerful. Many men now view their lives as systems rather than stories. Systems can be optimized. Stories are subject to interpretation. Men prefer systems. They focus on inputs they can control and outputs they can measure. Health improves with consistency. Finances improve with discipline. Skills improve with practice. These relationships are clear. Social dynamics are not. They are variable, emotional, and often influenced by incentives that shift without warning. Men chose clarity over complexity. This choice does not make them antisocial, it makes them intentional. They still form bonds, but those bonds are fewer, deeper, and more stable. Trust is earned slowly and given carefully. This is why men are no longer impressed by surface level charm or rhetoric. They look for consistency, for alignment between words and actions, for predictability over time. Anything else is noise. As this mindset spreads, the idea of men returning to old patterns becomes less likely. Not because men are stubborn, but because the alternatives are better. A life with fewer dependencies is resilient. A life with fewer obligations is flexible. A life with fewer conflicts is sustainable. Men discovered that sustainability matters more than excitement. This discovery reframed everything. It reframed work. Men began valuing autonomy over prestige. It reframed living arrangements. Men prioritized affordability and simplicity. It reframed relationships. Men prioritized peace over intensity. None of this happened because men were told to do it. It happened because the outcomes reinforced it. When you make a choice and your life improves, you repeat it. This repetition turns behavior into identity. Men no longer see themselves as missing out. They see themselves as opting in to a different model of living, one that fits reality as it is rather than how it was described. This model does not require widespread approval. It works regardless, and that is what makes it powerful. As more men adopt this approach, the cultural conversation will continue to lag behind behavior. Words will chase actions, explanations will chase outcomes, but outcomes do not wait. Men are already living in the next phase, and the distance between those phases is growing. As the distance between expectation and reality widens, something else becomes impossible to ignore. Men are no longer asking for permission to define their lives. They are doing it quietly, without debate, and without seeking validation. That alone marks a fundamental shift. For generations, men were conditioned to believe that their worth was externally assigned, that it came from approval, from being chosen, from being needed. When that framework collapsed, it created a vacuum. What filled that vacuum was not anger, but self determination. Men began to ask a question that had been buried for a long time. What do I actually want, separate from what I was told to want? Once that question is asked honestly, it changes everything. The answer for many men was surprisingly simple. They wanted calm. They wanted predictability. They wanted fairness. They wanted to be left alone to build something that made sense to them. These desires are not radical, they are basic, but for a long time they were treated as secondary to external expectations. When men started honoring those desires, their lives began to stabilize. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily. Small improvements added up. Less conflict meant better sleep. Better sleep meant clearer thinking. Clearer thinking meant better decisions. This compounding effect is why men are reluctant to reverse course. Once you experience a calmer baseline, chaos feels intolerable. What once seemed normal now feels unnecessary. That is another reason why nostalgia based appeals fail. Asking men to return to how things used to be assumes that the past was working for them. For many, it was not. It was merely familiar. Familiar discomfort is still discomfort. Men learned that just because something is familiar does not mean it is healthy. That realization alone reshaped their tolerance thresholds. Tolerance dropped, standards rose. This is not arrogance, it is calibration. Men recalibrated what they are willing to accept in their lives. They stopped tolerating constant stress. They stopped normalizing imbalance. They stopped excusing behavior that undermined their peace. And this recalibration is often mischaracterized as emotional withdrawal. In reality, it is emotional discipline. Men are choosing where to invest emotionally rather than scattering that investment indiscriminately. This discipline also changed how men process feedback. They no longer internalize criticism that does not come from a place of respect or understanding. They evaluate it, discard what is unhelpful, and move on. That emotional resilience was built through experience, through years of being told conflicting things, through watching incentives shift, through seeing outcomes that did not match promises. Men adapted by trusting patterns over narratives. Patterns showed them that effort alone does not guarantee fairness, that good intentions do not prevent negative outcomes, That accountability is often unevenly applied. Once these patterns were clear, men stopped arguing with them. They worked around them, and working around something does not mean pretending it does not exist. It means acknowledging it honestly and adjusting behavior accordingly. Men adjusted by reducing exposure. Reduced exposure led to reduced stress. Reduced stress led to increased capacity. That capacity was redirected toward things that reliably produced returns: health, skills, savings, personal projects. These areas reward consistency. They are not subject to shifting interpretations. This is why many men describe their lives as quieter but more productive. Fewer distractions allow deeper focus. Deeper focus produces tangible results. Those results reinforce the behavior that produced them. This feedback loop is powerful. As men grow more self sufficient, their need for external validation diminishes further. They no longer seek to be understood by everyone. Being understood by themselves is enough. This internal grounding changes how men move through social spaces. They are less reactive, less defensive, less eager to prove anything. That composure is often misread as detachment, but it is actually confidence, confidence that does not need to announce itself. This kind of confidence cannot be shamed out of someone. It cannot be coerced. It can only be invited. An invitation requires something many have not yet offered: peace. Without peace, there is nothing to negotiate. This is why the conversation feels stalled. One side is speaking in terms of narratives and ideals. The other is responding with lived experience and outcomes. These are different languages. Men are no longer persuaded by what something is supposed to mean. They care about what it actually produces. If something produces stress, they avoid it. If it produces stability, they consider it. This is not ideological, it is practical. Practical thinking becomes more common under pressure, and pressure is increasing everywhere. Economic uncertainty, social volatility, while rising costs. These conditions reward caution. Men who walked away early adapted before the pressure intensified. That head start matters. It allowed them to build buffers: financial buffers, emotional buffers, lifestyle buffers. Buffers create resilience. Resilient people are difficult to manipulate. This is another uncomfortable truth. Men who are resilient cannot be easily pressured back into roles that no longer serve them. They have alternatives. They have systems. They have routines that work. Returning would require giving those things up. Few people willingly abandon what works. This does not mean men are closed off forever. It means the threshold for engagement is higher, much higher. The old assumption was that men would endure discomfort for the sake of connection. That assumption no longer holds. Men now ask whether connection improves their lives or complicates them, and that question is non negotiable. As more men reach this conclusion, the cultural landscape shifts slowly but permanently. Participation becomes selective, engagement becomes conditional, roles become optional. This is not collapse, it is correction, a correction toward balance. Balance requires reciprocity, it requires respect, it requires predictability. Without those, men will continue to choose distance, not as protest, as preference. When you step back and look at everything that has happened, it becomes clear that this moment was inevitable. Not because anyone planned it, not because there was a single turning point, but because systems always reveal their limits over time. When pressure is applied unevenly for long enough, something gives. In this case, what gave was participation. Men did not disappear overnight. They faded from places where their presence was no longer valued, but still expected. They stopped filling gaps that were taken for granted. They stopped volunteering to be the stabilizing force in environments that offered them no stability in return. This was not revenge, it was realism. Reality has a way of cutting through ideology. You can argue against it, you can label it, you can moralize it, but you cannot negotiate with it. Men learned this lesson by living it. They learned that the world does not reward intention, it rewards alignment, and alignment begins with honesty. Honesty about limits, honesty about incentives, honesty about what a life actually feels like day to day. For many men, honesty meant admitting that the constant push to participate in systems that drained them was unsustainable. It meant acknowledging that they were not broken for wanting peace. It meant accepting that walking away was not failure, but self respect. Once that honesty took hold, everything else followed naturally. Men stopped trying to be understood by people who had no interest in understanding them. They stopped explaining themselves to audiences that had already made up their minds. They stopped playing roles that required endless sacrifice with no security. They simplified. Simplicity is powerful because it removes leverage from anyone who relies on your overextension. When your life is simple, fewer people can pull you in directions you do not want to go. Fewer expectations can be placed on you without your consent. Men discovered that simplicity is not emptiness, it is clarity. With clarity comes confidence, not loud confidence, not performative confidence, quiet confidence, the kind that does not need to announce itself, the kind that does not seek approval, the kind that does not panic when challenged. This confidence is built on self trust. And self trust is built by keeping promises to yourself. Men kept one promise above all others. They promised themselves they would no longer live in constant tension. Everything else flows from that. When people ask why men are not returning, why they seem disengaged, why they are uninterested in old narratives, the answer is simple. They already built lives that work for them. Not perfect lives, not easy lives, but lives that are stable, predictable, and aligned. It is very hard to convince someone to abandon alignment. Men are no longer waiting for permission to live this way. They are already doing it quietly, consistently, without apology. This does not mean men are incapable of connection. It means connection must now meet a higher standard. It must offer peace instead of pressure, cooperation instead of conflict, mutual responsibility instead of one sided expectation. Anything less is no longer competitive with solitude. That is the part many still struggle to understand. Solitude is no longer a punishment, it is an option. And often, it is the better one. When solitude brings calm, clarity, and progress, it becomes difficult to frame it as loss. It becomes a foundation. Men built that foundation deliberately, brick by brick, decision by decision. And now, standing on that foundation, they can see clearly. They can see which paths lead to growth and which lead back to chaos. They can see which relationships are sustainable and which are not. They can see which narratives match reality and which collapse under scrutiny. This vision is not easily clouded again. As society continues to change, as economic pressure increases, as expectations continue to shift, this clarity will matter even more. Men who understand themselves and protect their peace will be the ones who endure. Endurance today does not look like sacrifice, it looks like selectivity. Selectivity in where you invest your time, selectivity in who you trust, selectivity in what you tolerate. Men walking away did not do so because they could not handle responsibility. They did so because they finally took responsibility for their own well being. That distinction matters. If there is one thing to take away from all of this, it is that silence is not absence, or silence is choice. And men have chosen carefully. The conversation is not over, the consequences are still unfolding, but the direction is clear. Men are not coming back to the old world, they are building a new one for themselves. As this shift continues, one thing becomes impossible to deny. Men did not walk away because they were defeated. They walked away because they finally understood the environment they were operating in. Once that understanding set in, participation stopped being automatic and became conditional. Men stopped reacting to pressure and started responding to outcomes. For many men, the most surprising part of walking away was how quickly their lives stabilized. Without constant emotional friction, they slept better. Without unpredictable expectations, they planned better. Without constant judgment, they thought more clearly. Life did not become perfect, but it became manageable. And manageability is the foundation of peace. Peace changed how men evaluated everything. Relationships were no longer viewed as achievements or obligations, but as potential additions to an already stable life. If something added stress, uncertainty, or imbalance, it failed the test. If it added calm, cooperation, and predictability, it was considered. This was not cruelty or indifference, it was responsibility. Men learned that peace is fragile and must be protected. Once lost, it is difficult to recover. That understanding made men selective, not closed off. They did not stop caring. They stopped overextending. They stopped sacrificing stability for approval. They stopped negotiating their well being away. Another truth many struggle to accept is that men did not replace relationships with emptiness. They replaced chaos with structure. Solitude became space rather than punishment. Space to think, space to rest, space to build. Many men discovered that being alone was not the same as feeling lonely. In fact, the absence of constant pressure allowed them to reconnect with themselves. This reconnection reshaped priorities. Men focused on health, routine, and financial discipline. They invested in skills that produced tangible results. They valued consistency over intensity. They learned that progress does not require noise, it requires discipline. As economic pressure increased, this mindset proved even more valuable. Men who simplified their lives were more resilient. Fewer obligations meant fewer points of failure. Fewer dependencies meant more flexibility. Stability was no longer dependent on external validation or social approval. What unsettled many was that men did not appear angry. They were calm. Calm is difficult to argue with. Calm does not seek permission. Calm does not explain itself. Calm simply continues. This calm made one thing clear. Men are no longer motivated by narratives. They are motivated by outcomes. They trust what they can observe over what they are told. They watch actions instead of listening to promises. If something works, they keep it. If it does not, they leave it behind. That is why appeals based on guilt or obligation no longer resonate. Men have already lived that version of life. They measured it honestly. They compared it to what they have now, and they chose what produced better results. Men are not disappearing from society. They are redefining their participation in it. They are no longer default providers or automatic buffers. They are selective contributors. Engagement must be mutual, respectful, and stable. Anything less is no longer competitive with solitude. This is not the end of relationships. It is the end of imbalance. If men return, it will not be to the conditions that pushed them away. It will be to something new, something grounded in reciprocity rather than expectation. Whether society adapts to this reality smoothly or painfully remains to be seen. But one thing is already settled. Men are not going back to how things were. The past no longer appeals to them. They have experienced a different way of living and it works. Men walking away did not do so because they could not handle responsibility. They did so because they finally took responsibility for themselves. That distinction matters. Before we wrap this up, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed in this video? Do you agree with this shift or do you see it differently? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts because this conversation matters. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.